Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Be Like Christ for our 5-minute Bible study through Exodus chapter 20. We're at the halfway point of Exodus. Exodus has got 40 chapters, if I remember correctly. So today, chapter 20. Free PDF of all this information. The handout is available on our website at tobelikechrist.com. There's a link down in the description if you are watching the YouTube channel. I think it's actually also in the podcast show notes. When did the events of Exodus chapter 20 take place? Well, this is probably getting repetitive to those of you who have been doing this study every day, but the children of Israel got out of slavery in Egypt in approximately 1491 BC, so 1500 years before Jesus was born. The events of Exodus chapter 20 specifically took place 3 months after the Hebrews left Egypt. We learn that in chapter 19, verse 1. Our characters in this chapter are pretty familiar. We have God, who has descended on Mount Sinai. You remember the mountain was covered in smoke and lightning and fire, and there were earthquakes going on, and the people had to consecrate themselves for 3 days before God's presence arrived on the mountain. So we're still talking about that as we go into Exodus chapter 20. We have the Israelite people, or also known as the Hebrews, who were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were God's special people who he was leading to the promised land, or the Canaan land, through the wilderness. And then Moses. Moses was God's chosen representative to be the leader of the Israelites. Thinking about our map, we haven't moved anywhere since Exodus chapter 19. The children of Israel left a place called Rephidim, and they are still camped at Mount Sinai, at the foot of the mountain. Now let's jump right into our outline. Exodus chapter 20 is a pretty famous chapter in the Bible because it contains something called the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments we will talk about in verses 1 through 21. They were a famous list of laws that were given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. But do keep this in mind. The 10 Commandments aren't the totality of the laws that God gave to the Israelites. I think some people are under the impression that they were. There were many other laws that God gave, but the 10 Commandments are kind of highlighted. So let's talk about these 10 Commandments. And I'll just go 1 through 10 down the line and explain them, or read kind of the general idea of the commandment. Number 1, the Hebrews were not to honor any other gods above the Lord who had delivered them from Egypt. Number 2, they were not to make idols or worship any kind of man-made image. Commandment number 3, they were not to take the Lord's name in vain. Number 4, Israel was to observe a Sabbath day, as we've talked about previously. Every day of the week, on the seventh day of the week, is supposed to be a day of rest dedicated to the Lord, just as God had rested on the seventh day of creation. So the Sabbath has its roots back in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 when God created everything. Number 5, the Israelites were to honor their father and their mother. Number 6, they were not to murder. Number 7, they were not to commit adultery. Number 8, they were not allowed to steal. Number 9, they were not to give false testimony. And then number 10, they were told not to covet the possessions of others. So that then leads us into our second section, verses 18 through 21. The Israelites fear God. I couldn't come up with a better title than that for these couple verses. But when the Israelites saw the flashes of lightning and they heard the sound of the trumpet that was coming from the mountain, they were afraid. And they told Moses that they didn't want to speak to God or have God speak to them directly. They wanted Moses to speak to God on their behalf because they were frightened. And Moses told them that God had descended on the mountain in part so that they would learn to reverence him and therefore obey him. Right? So they were seeing how great he was, and hopefully that stuck with them so that in the future, whenever they didn't have water, whenever they didn't have food, whenever they ran into a predicament again, they wouldn't start complaining like they had in the past, but they would remember this scene on Mount Sinai and they'd be like, okay, God is capable of taking care of us, and certainly he deserves our trust and our respect. Then the final section of chapter 20, verses 22 through 26. Laws about building altars. So kind of a curious section to close out. The Hebrews were to offer sacrifices to God on altars that were made of earth. If an altar was made of stone, that altar was not to be crafted with tools. It was to be built only with unhewn stones. And the last instruction God gave about altars is that they were not to have steps ascending to the offering place, so that their, quote, nakedness would not be exposed to those who were below them as they climbed the stairs ascending to the altar. And so that is Exodus chapter 20. We're going to talk more about God's interactions with the people on Mount Sinai and other interesting laws that God gives to the people in future chapters. But for now, let's talk about our application as we close. In this chapter, God was calling a special people to himself, and he was giving them special laws so that they stood out from the other nations, so that they were distinct from the other nations. God has always wanted his people to pursue holiness and to live lives separate from the immoralities of the world. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 7 says, "For God has not called us to impurity, but in holiness." As followers of God, we aren't to participate in the things that corrupt God's good creation, but we're to strive to live as we were created, in the image of God. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. 1 Peter, which is in a book in the New Testament, chapter 1, verses 14 through 16 says this, "As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, 'You shall be holy, for I am holy.'" So as we come to know God better, we should strive to be like him. And we want to purge our lives of things that are contrary to his nature. We don't want to do things that God would never do. And so we see God expecting holiness of his people in the Old Testament, and we are also supposed to be striving for holiness even in the new covenant, under the new promises that we've been given in Jesus.